So I'll just say a couple of things first, and then I wanted to get to Casey's questions. And um, I'm very open and willing to talk about pretty much anything. So feel free, even if it's off the questions that Casey provided in the beginning, that's perfectly fine on my end. So I guess I was kind of reflecting on a conversation earlier today, and I had a coworker who was talking to me quite a bit, and I've been thinking a lot about a lot of different things recently, and there's like a conversation that I've been having, both with my family and a bunch of other people, both about like my path to where I got today and a lot of different things. And I like talking about it. I would love to keep talking about these type of things. One of the things that I would say that I struggled with for a long time is that there are parts of you that are great, and you will not fully recognize them for a long time. It took me years to figure out what I was good at, and I don't think I have yet figured out what I am great at. So it's like a very profound life lesson to kind of lead off with. I would also say the only way to find those great parts of yourself is to start exposing them to the world and be very open with what you find good in you. I've struggled with that quite a bit as well. And I was talking with, I'm sorry that I'm like some of this stuff is a little bit, like I'm kind of thinking back on it and what I was like in your shoes. And I, to a certain extent, remember what it was like. And one of the things I said today to a coworker at Paychex, which right now I'm an enterprise architect there, which is a relatively high level position that I still don't really know how I got into. And I can talk a little bit about how that happened. But I feel blessed to have it. It's like that position has changed my life, and I'm thankful for it every day. But one of the things I said today was I was having a conversation with a coworker, and I found that for most of my life, when I felt discomfort, I knew that there was change. And that's one of the things I would encourage you in a lot of different categories. Like your career is often driven by the desire to avoid discomfort. And I think that that's kind of a dangerous thing. And I think that that's something that I pushed really hard on for most of my life. I really stepped pretty far out of my comfort zone a lot of times. And people tell me that's kind of strange. And I probably agree with that. I don't really know where I'm going next, and I think that's okay. And I don't really know where the conversation today is going. I think that's okay too. I know that I love people, and that's something that makes me very good at my job. And I want to see people be happy. And I find that most of the time, if I go into a conversation and I just kind of ask people what they like or what they're concerned about, or, you know, what it is that I might have said in a previous conversation that was bothering them, I have a very productive conversation. And most of the time when I feel pain, it's when I don't do those things. I most often feel pain when I don't kind of dive headfirst into those. And that was a very long running life lesson for me to learn. So I would encourage you, when you are confronted with a situation where you are uncertain, learn to tolerate discomfort. It's a very, very powerful tool in your toolkit. And I don't think you have to constantly be putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. I don't think that that's kind of a way to live life. I think that that's very difficult. But I do think that finding areas where you know that you are uncomfortable is probably you finding the areas where you're most likely to experience some growth. One thing I would say is I really try. I think I try. I feel like I try. I'm not sure I always do a good job to help, and I don't really know how a lot of the time. But like asking a question about how I can help is something that's a very powerful skill. It doesn't always come across as like an expected question in a professional workplace environment, but it's very helpful. So I would encourage you to do that. And I think that's something that I really brought in from kind of the more unexpected spaces of my life, where you never really know like what people want. You know, you never know. You sit down at a business meeting, you know, and you're not inside of a corporate culture, and you don't know what people at the table want. So just asking people, can you tell me a little bit about what it is that you want to do? Like what does your vision of the future look like? I find that to be a very, very helpful thing to do. And I've also often found that when I don't do that, I end up very misaligned with people very quickly, and it can be kind of a damaging thing. So I would encourage you to do that. It's not always easy though. One thing I would definitely say is it is okay to fail. Like, I fail every day, all the time. I'm failing right now. I'm failing to like control my emotions and make it through this thing, right? But that is a lesson that was another one that was very long running lesson for me to learn. And I think it is a very helpful one to know. There's actually a couple of students currently in McQuaid, and I won't say their names if they prefer to remain anonymous, but I would love it if they join for this conversation, where they joined a school that I founded a couple of years ago. And it was kind of this like, it was almost like a renegade school. It was pretty wild. And it was based on the students being exposed to failure every day and learning how to deal with that. And we did it with a whole bunch of different things. We did it with sports. So we had them play a sport we knew they wanted to get better at, and we would have a systematic drill every day that we knew that they were not as good as they could be. We knew that they wanted to get better at it, and they would do that every day. Like a different drill every day, but they would be exposed to a drill in their sport every day that they were not as good as they wanted to be. And they knew they didn't hold up to their own standards. We would make that happen. And then in the education space, we would give them tests that were a little too hard for them. And we would do it all the time. But we would let them take the test like 3 or 4 times, because I was kind of the mindset, like, where's their spot in your life where you have a test like that and you can't untake it and try it again? And I just kind of started asking, like, who wrote the rule on that? And that was kind of a moment of very much like disruptive thought for me, where I was trying to figure out, like, where are the rules on this thing? And the answer is there's far more assumptions around these things than there are rules. And I would encourage you to follow rules, but test assumptions. And that is another profound thing that I've learned throughout my life. I'm very much a rule follower. I try to be. I don't always follow the rules. I have patterns of breaking the rules, and that's something that I try to work on. But it's really more about, I think, testing the assumptions rather than testing the rules. I still kind of struggle with failure. Like, I have a great job that I'm very thankful for. And I still don't really know what to do with it. Like, I can't figure out, you know, how I landed in this spot, like how it is that there's like 100 people who are listening to what I say on a day-to-day basis. And I don't know why. Like, I'm a smart guy and I know what I'm talking about, but I took this wild route to get there. I started a bunch of companies that some of them succeeded, some of them failed, some of them I had to run myself. And I just kept like trying different things. And eventually I tried something, and I kind of fell into this spot in paychecks, and it kind of clicked a little bit. And I can talk a little bit about why I think that is, but you just kind of keep chipping away at it until you find a little groove where you land. And I just think you do that with your career. You do that with the people who are around you. You do that with your ideas. You do that with everything. You just kind of, you chip away a little bit at the pieces that are like the rough edges. And then eventually there's something that's not a rough edge anymore. And that's how I would recommend that you live life. Like, identify the friction, figure out where the rough edges are, and chip away at them. And I don't think it's much more complicated than that. And I think you can get through a lot of questions and a lot of concerns just by doing that. Like, where's the rough edge? And there's more complex problems than that, to be sure, but I think that gets you pretty far. One other thing I would definitely say is that only you have the ability to ruin your own life. Like, no one's out there to ruin your life, really. I don't think. I think that there are things that happen to people, and there are bad things that happen to people, but only you can turn that into something that ruins your life. And I've struggled with that myself too. So those are kind of like long-running life lessons that I would say. As far as like how those apply to my job, I spend a lot of time like thinking about how people talk. And that's something I had to do for a significant part of my life. It's kind of figure out how people talk. And I think about it every day, all the time. What words they use and what those words mean, and do those words come into conflict with other words, and where did that word come from? Why did that word enter the conversation there? And I think that's one of the ways of kind of removing friction, is thinking about the way that people talk, and what it was that was in their head that made them say the thing while they're talking. So I'd encourage anyone who's kind of looking to do things like that, think about ways of removing friction by talking about where the friction exists. I'm going to look at the question list over here. Any connections between my current professional experience or classes I took in high school? I did a really wild public speaking presentation that was extremely politically incorrect, and it was kind of a different time. So I won't go into it. I'm not going to talk about it, but it was extremely politically incorrect, and I was basically asked to like keep doing it in different parts of the school. And I didn't really, I guess, understand why at the time, but it turned out it was really funny. And I got asked to do it like a bunch of different ways, almost like I was supposed to be like a traveling show, which was okay. But I found that public speaking is not always an easy thing. And sometimes being very humorous about things and at times slightly irreverent is kind of a helpful thing. I would say I tend to kind of test humor boundaries, maybe a little more than other people, but it's also a very valuable thing to kind of just ask someone, hey, did I cross a line? And I do that still. I had a conversation with someone on Monday that said, I'm relatively new to Paychex. I've only been there, I think, 7 months since October. And I just kind of said, is this something that kind of falls within the bounds of corporate culture? And like, please let me know if I crossed the line as far as the humor that I was engaged in. And there's something happened today that like was definitely a line crosser on my side. And I found that it can be very hard to get people to understand what they did. So I usually don't try. I usually just kind of listen to them and let them tell me what made them uncomfortable and these type of things. And I don't know that works perfectly, but I guess my default position is kind of one of the best things that you can fall back on is thinking that person is like a loving person and means well to you. And maybe they just took a misstep or something like that. And I would encourage you to think about it that way. And I'm not always perfect at that. I don't claim to be. I struggle with that too. What was my college major? Oh, that's a fun one. So college was a wild experience for me, but I studied physics at NYU, and I dual enrolled to study mechanical engineering at Stevens Institute of Technology. I didn't finish the mechanical engineering side, but I really enjoyed the physics side. And there's parts that you kind of learn in that experience. I took a lot of different things away from college. I would say one of the things that I told many of my students that I've had over the years is like, figure out what's good for you. And I, I personally think that there's not a lot of discussions about that. And I think there could be better discussions about, asking a kid, like, what's good for you? And I think that's a question a kid can answer. I think if you ask a kid, like, what's a good thing for you right now? Like, can you tell me a little bit about your 1-year goal or your 3-year goal or your 5-year goal? Like, what do you imagine yourself doing? What do you want your life to look like? I would ask my students that every week in the schools that I founded, and just encourage them to write them down. And a lot of times I would have them like draw pictures of it and think about like, how can I achieve that? And then sometimes they would set really lofty goals. I had one student who, I won't say his name, he's in McQuaid now, really wanted to be in the NHL. So his goal was always, I'm going to be the next big player in the NHL. And he would say really funny stuff about that. And that was his goal. And that was his vision. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there is anything wrong with that. But you also have to get yourself ready for when whatever your vision of success is not the life that you are living currently. And I think that that's like a really hard thing for a lot of people. That was a hard thing for me. Like I had the vision of what I thought success was, and I still don't really know what success is. I'm 33 years old. But like someone else could tell me what their version of success is, and I'll believe them. I don't know what my version of success is. I think it might be, I'd like to be happy and well-positioned within my community and have a loving family around me. Like those sound like success. And I don't know that that's a conversation that's happening all that often either, and I would encourage it. What kinds of things did I do to help me realize what I wanted to do? Outside of the box type things like internships, hobbies, etc. Yeah, so like starting the schools, I did a lot of kind of wild stuff. One thing is, so my parents are on, so this might be an interesting thing, but I remember like being given a computer when I was really young. And that's something that I learned on, and I learned a ton, like way outside of the box. I was like typing stuff into this computer by myself at the house, and that was like, it hooked me. So I would say I still remember that to this day. And I remember like the things that I was doing on that computer, and it was very formative for me. And I didn't even really take like a formal computer class, I think, until I was in like 6th grade. But by that time I think I actually built the computer lab for the school that I was going to at that point. And I have a parent on here who can check me if I was wrong, but I think actually my mother was setting up the computer lab that summer, and she like had me come in to partially connect everything and hook all these things up. And I enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun. And, I was kind of doing things in that space, and it was a little unusual, like, and that's okay. She says it was me and David Sloan. So if Dave Sloan, if you ever see this, I miss you, man. Like give me a call sometime. But yeah, like that stuff was a ton of fun. And it had nothing to do with, I wasn't getting like credit for it or anything. I think it was actually during the summer. And I don't remember all the details exactly, but it was not inside the box at all. But I enjoyed that. And I think that there's a lot of things like that I kind of let go a little underappreciated for a long time. I really enjoyed making music and like making art, and I was kind of talked out of those things, and I don't fault anyone for that. It was, my own fault for not pushing forward on it. But there's things that are like way outside of the box that I think are fascinating, and that's okay. Like there's no problem with that. What kinds of things did I built a lot of stuff at home. So I would take like Lego blocks and stuff, and I would build all different kinds of things, like little, I forget what they're called, but like the MindWorks robots, I think they have like little robotic things with Legos, and that really hooked me for a while. So I was like building stuff all the time, and I remember my parents would bring people over to the house. My father was either in med school or just had left med school, and he would have people come over, and we would just like sit at a table and build forts out of Legos. Like, there was no command to do that or anything like that. It was completely outside the box, and it was just a lot of fun. So when I got to high school, I really enjoyed like design and in a lot of ways, like kind of the creative angle of things. And I thought I wanted to be an architect. And it's funny, my title now is an enterprise architect, but I found out how much work it was, quite honestly. And you couldn't play sports. You couldn't, like you were expected to stay up like all the time and always be working on these models of buildings and things like that. And it's just not what I envisioned it would be like to build a house. Like I thought building a house would be fun. I didn't think it would be like staring down at a little table and putting pieces of wood together. I kind of thought being an architect was going to be like, let's all go build a house. And maybe that was naive on my part, but I thought I would be like actually designing when I went in there. And I would say like, I want to draw this thing. And this is what I have in my mind. I want to get it out of my head. And I didn't think that would take like 15 hours a day to do that. So that kind of lined me up with like the design and building things angle. But I found that because that was so much work, I basically just like canned that. I still wanted to play sports. I was playing volleyball at that time. And I was doing all right at it, I guess. I went to school I played at NYU a little bit for like my first 2 years, and then like my knees kind of blew up and I wasn't really keeping in shape, so I couldn't keep up. But after that, I kind of just took all that creativity and dumped it into like building software. So I started building websites and stuff like that. It was like really wild time. It's probably hard to imagine now, but back then nobody had a website. So I just kind of said, like, I can do that stuff. And there was this guy who I owe a lot of my kind of disruptability and entrepreneurship experience to, who was a family friend. His name was Al. He was a little bit of a wild man, but probably so am I. And he basically just said like, yeah, let's have Matt over and give it a shot. And it got a little crazy at times, but I thought that was fun. Like I was over there once and he asked me to rewire his house. And another time he had me dig up a 7-foot segment of sewage pipe in his front yard. I was like, I'm here to build a website, man, but whatever you need. And that's just kind of how it went. And I think that those are good things. I think kind of not knowing exactly what is going to happen is a good thing. And I don't know that really that's always viewed that way. So I would encourage you to think like, maybe something else could happen. Maybe there are other outcomes on this. And maybe there's a different way of looking at it that could generate a different outcome. And that's something that I have really carried forward with me. What advice do I have for current high school students, college students, or young alumni interested in your profession? Well, yeah, I'm kind of in the software design space. I'm kind of also in like the business development space. So expose yourself to as much interesting stuff as you can and let it change you. Like just find yourself constantly fascinated by design choices and why someone built something a certain way. And just keep asking about it. Like the best thing that you can do if you want to head into like a creative position is just keep asking questions all the time. That's when I joined Paychex, my manager, who is, I think definitively one of the best managers I've ever seen in my life. And I don't know many other people that could manage me. I'm kind of a crazy person, but he basically just said like, just keep asking questions all the time. And I think that kind of staying curious and continuing to ask questions like that is a very powerful tool. I think I've talked a lot, so I'd probably pause there and say, I'm happy to answer questions. And, I hope parts of that were informative and on point for what you were hoping. I can speak a little bit more clearly if you'd like about like the things that I've done, if that's interesting. I can speak a little bit more about like myself, but I'm happy to do whatever.
As we have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, and then we'll just take questions as they come in. I do have a question. I would love for you to kind of speak on some of the startups that you've worked with and kind of how you got into that space, and then maybe a little bit more on your position now at Paychex, if you don't mind.
Sure. Do you want me to do that right now? Were there
Yeah,
any
sure.
other questions you
That's
wanted
my
me to field,
question.
or okay?
Yeah.
So I'll start with let me start with the first part. So some of the other startup positions that I've had, I kind of went through a period of my life where I was just like starting businesses all the time, and sometimes I didn't even really do anything with them. Sometimes I would just like I would have the idea in the back of my mind, and I couldn't get it out of my head. Like it was stuck there. So I started a bunch of things that like some of them were half baked, some of them turned into real businesses, some of them didn't, and like that was okay. And I just kind of treated it that way. Um, so I started a computer software company, which was called Robot Elf. And I had like drew up a little mascot of a robot, um, like skating around on little roller skates. He was like Robbie the Robot Elf. I actually still have it like framed in my house somewhere. I don't know. Um, but it was just online web development, internet marketing, and things like that. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but it was, I can't remember if we were married at the time, but my wife and I both worked on it together. Like she did a lot of the marketing work. I did a lot of the web development stuff. We went out and I sat down with a guy who was starting a festival in Rochester called the Backyard Burger Fest. And I think this was about maybe 6 years ago now. And we just talked about like, how do you want to market this thing? And just sat down, I think we went to his house actually, and just talked to him about like, what's your marketing strategy? And I think those are great business questions to ask. And I've just been kind of exposing myself to as many of those business questions as I can. And I don't have all those business questions figured out. But that's kind of the strategy that I took on those is like, let's just go in and kind of chop up a business idea a little bit. And I found that a lot of fun. What else did I do? I started an education company. So I was kind of a roaming tutor for a while, like just traveling around and teaching people. I think I was like pretty good at it. I still don't really know, but like teaching people math and physics and stuff like that, a lot of kind of science and math things. And I actually have a brother who went to McQuaid as well. His name's Noah. And he and I both did that. I like made him business cards and said like, you can take these and like go pick up clients. And if I have any that are like an English student or something like that, I would reach out to him and just say like, here you go. This is, that's someone that I could take as a student, but you're better at it. And, that was something that I think he wanted to do at the time. And I just kind of checked, is that something you want to do? And then we did it. And I kind of did the same thing with him at the schools. And like, if you walked into one of the schools I was running, you would be like, what is this guy doing? Type of thing. Like, that's the question you should ask when you walk in. Because it was really weird. Like I ran them inside of an ice rink because they were all mostly hockey students. And it was online. So you'd like open up your computer and you'd be doing your schoolwork there. And then you had like me on the other side of the room. And people would come over and say like, I think I need a little help on this part. I think I don't need help on this part. I just kind of want to like steam forward and do all of my math for the week. And they would do all their math for the week because they felt like doing it that day. And that was fine. And then the next day they might come in and say like, I have this thing, I need to read it and I don't really want to read. And I would just say, okay, like do it tomorrow or do it next week. Like why does it getting done today really matter? I don't think it matters all that much as long as you get it done by like the end of the year or the end of the semester. And even then, like if it rolled into the beginning of the next semester, that was fine. I just said like, jumpstart your math for the next semester. It was okay. So there's a lot of stuff that was kind of, I had my brother come in and work on that with me, and I'm sure he thinks that I'm kind of a wild man, which is okay. But that was an enjoyable experience, and I got to do it with one of my family members, and I would say it could be a little tricky going into any kind of business arrangement with your family members, and I've experienced that. But as long as everyone's like very upfront about what they want, I think it can be okay. And if there's any times where people kind of feel like it has not gotten to be okay, that's just like shoot that person a message and say, like, some of this got a little backwards. And I think we can kind of figure that out. That's okay too. Like, I guess one of my messages might be, things will be more okay than you might think. As long as you're kind of stepping into that space where there's assumptions and starting to just like poke at them a little bit and say like, what do you think's going on here? You don't have to be, you don't have to be like confrontational about it. You can just ask it as a question and say like, I kind of noticed this thing. Like, what do you think about that? And it usually tells you either like this person's like a normal human being and they kind of respond to you pretty normally, or they become very defensive and you kind of say like, I can see there's something here that like maybe I don't fully understand. And that's okay too. Sometimes those people are better to just kind of set in a different category. That's not to say that they can't, like they can be your friends, they can be involved with you, but like there's certain conversations you wouldn't have with them. So there's a couple of things I did there. Let's see, what else have I done? I wrote a book recently. I'd never written a book before. Didn't really know how to do it. And I just sat down one day and like a bunch of words started falling out of me. And I decided to go online and figure out like, how do you publish a book? And just sat down and figured out how to publish a book. Like the tools really are out there. So like I'm someone who's pretty tech savvy, but if you know how to use like an internet search, you can find a lot of stuff. And I would still encourage you to find a lot of stuff. Like there's a huge toolkit out in the world that's just like right now at this point in history, waiting to be used. And I think we've kind of under leveraged that toolkit sometimes. So as far as writing the book, I had no idea what I was doing. I printed a whole bunch of pages off a whole bunch of times. I probably burned I didn't burn them, but I probably went through like 300 spare pages of stuff where I would just print things out and say like, well, this isn't good enough. And then I would throw the whole thing away. But it was like this process of refinement, which I think is very important. I think that the process of refining things is something that we're really, especially in Rochester, we've kind of gotten away from. And I've been talking to quite a few people about that. Like even the name of where we position ourselves in the state, we call it the Rust Belt. But I was talking with a bunch of entrepreneurs yesterday, and I said, what if we just started calling ourselves the Refinement Belt? And we just started refining things all the time. What if we just started like refining ideas, refining materials, refining each other, right? Like that would be a beautiful thing. And I think I would kind of encourage that approach to talking about like what we're doing. I think refining is very important. As far as kind of the outcome from that, it's been a really interesting experience. Like I'd never written a book before. I didn't know what to expect, and I was okay with any outcome. Like if people tell me it's bad, I'll believe them. If people tell me it's good, I don't usually believe them, but I'll take that feedback. But I'm okay with people telling me one way or another. So I like did that, and then I was part of this like local area entrepreneurship meetup group, which is a really cool space to fall into because you can kind of go into those conversations and everyone is already in a disruption world. So they kind of know that people who come there throw ideas out all the time. And I usually speak extremely directly, and that's not always the best communication style. And I'm definitely guilty of applying it in the wrong forums. Like it wouldn't be a good thing to use it here to say like very direct things. And that's definitely true. But in those spaces, you get this like very structured feedback very fast. So one of them just heard that I had written a book and they like sent me this message. It was beautiful. It said like, I took this to my local area book club and we like started voting on which part of your book was the most difficult to get past. And then she came back and she talked to me about it and kind of asked like, what do you do when you run into these problems? Like she came back and just said like, what do you do when this happens? And the question that she asked was like, how do you deal with frustration? And I said very bluntly, like, I'm not always great at it. Like I have a punching bag and a weight set in my basement because sometimes like physical exertion helps with those things. And I'm not saying that's the best way to do it, but sometimes that's a good mechanism of handling frustration. I found for me. I'm not saying that's true for anyone else. And if it's different for you, that's okay too. But then there's kind of these baseline patterns that you can work through. And I said a bunch of things in there that were, like if you're frustrated, maybe find a smaller part of your task. Like same thing that I was saying about the students earlier. if you're frustrated that you're not an NHL player yet, find out what step it might take to get you one step closer to being an NHL player. Like, can you tie your skates? Are you able to tie your skates? No, you can't? All right, well, we've got a little bit of work to do, but let's figure out if you can tie your skates. And, you know, I kind of like, there's this phrase that people use called dog fooding in the entrepreneurship world, where you kind of you use your business as like the proving ground for yourself. So when I joined this school, I didn't know how to skate. I'd been on hockey skates once in my life, and they were probably from like the 1980s. And I think I like very nearly broke my ankles. It was hilarious, right? So I had never skated before, and I was 25 years old. So I just decided, like, I'm gonna go jump on the ice. There's a bunch of kids out here who can skate circles around me, and I'm just gonna go see what I can learn. And maybe I'll be good at hockey, and maybe I won't. And either one's okay. And I fell on my face all the time, and the kids got to laugh at me, and that's okay. I can laugh at myself when I fall on my face. That's one of the only things that I know to do when I fall on my face. Like, you can either be embarrassed or laugh at yourself, right? Or maybe a little bit of both, whatever you want to do. So I learned a lot there, and I learned a lot about like how to put yourself in a spot where you know that you would like to be better at something that you know you're not good at, and what the small step that you can take could look like. And we would just practice that every day, all day, with everything. Like I didn't make them. The students sat down and like designed t-shirts that described what it was that they wanted to accomplish for the year. And they would come up with a logo that explained what they wanted to be by the end of the year. And we would say, like, okay, are you practicing that thing? Like, this is what you identified for yourself. Did you fall a little short? And if you did, what can we do? And if the answer was nothing, like that never really happens. But if the answer is like, you can't do anything, that's like one conversation. But most of the time, what it comes down to is like one very small step. Like, I didn't know how to tie my skates. I'm not going to be an NHL hockey player. I learned how to tie skates. Then I learned how to tie their kids' skates, because a lot of times they were too young to be able to tie their own. And then I ended up like going out into the city with one of the schools that I was affiliated with. And we ran this like learn to skate program for a bunch of inner city school kids who had really never experienced anything like that before. And I didn't like ask for that in the beginning. I didn't know I was going to do that, but I ended up, I'm skating around, and I have a school teacher holding onto my hand for dear life, trying to make it around the boards, with a bunch of kids that all have helmets on in case they wipe out. And I feel like I probably should have had a helmet on in case I wiped out, but I didn't. I didn't wipe out, and I didn't have a helmet on. So, I didn't do either of those. But that was a ton of fun. And, we brought the students along with us, and there were 4 students from that school that were just skating around, and they were like the experts on the ice for the day. And I thought that was great for 2 reasons. One is that you're showing this new skill to a bunch of kids that might never have seen it before. Like, they could have, if I was putting myself in their shoes, I would have liked to have been on skates when I was that age. I think that would have been fun, So like, that's cool to expose someone to that. And then on the other side, the students that were part of the school who were like mind-blowingly good at hockey. Like, you can't even imagine how good these kids are. Like, one of them's probably going in the NHL now. His name's Jeremy Schwartz. If you want to look him up, he like played for the Junior Sabres and Canadian teams. He's an absolute beast. And, is someone that I think a lot of people have a lot of pride in. But maybe pride is not the right word in that situation. Maybe they have a lot of, they like the way that he's turned out, I guess would be the way that I would say that. But these kids are skating around in circles, and they're the best player on the ice by far. So you find that all of a sudden they start doing these like different things that you've never seen them do before. Like, all of a sudden they turn around and start helping people just because they're the best on the ice, right? And I think that that's like kind of close to a universal thing, is that if you realize you're the best at something, which is sometimes very hard to do, I think that's one of the hardest things to do in life, is to realize that you are the best at things. That's like, I think that's one of the reasons like Michael Jordan became so great, is he basically said, I'm not the best. I'm not the best that I can be, right? So he just kept getting better, kept refining himself to this absolutely insane competitive standard. But I think once you kind of realize you're the best, one of the things that tends to happen is you kind of look around you and you say, first, you might say some things that are not great, like, look at me type of things. And I struggle with that sometimes. But then eventually you kind of say, like, let's see if, like, let me show you something, right? And like, I got to watch things like that happen in young kids. And that was an incredible experience that I like don't really know how to replicate, but it was very enjoyable. So I just talked a lot about like entrepreneurship stuff. I feel like I should talk a little bit about my corporate stuff. It was my job there. It's like almost hard to define what it is that an enterprise architect does. I'm still not, I think that it's such like a free form job that you can probably make it into a lot of different things. And I think sometimes that's really good, and sometimes that's not so good. Like if you have a role that you fall into and it can be pretty much whatever you want, what I would encourage you to do is grow as much as possible until you hit some kind of barrier. Because I think that hitting those barriers and learning from them is where that like the rough edge comes in. And as you're rubbing up against that rough edge, that's like the discomfort, and you figure out how to grow. And I think that there's, kind of figuring out where you want to land in a company or things like that. Early on in your career, there tends to be these very boxed in roles, like very, very boxed in. You're here to punch these numbers and, you're going to send this file over here, or I'm kind of doing a computer software thing, but like that's usually what a role looks like. And it's very formulaic. But then as you kind of, like as your career opens up a little bit, there tends to be these roles that are much more like nebulous. So on any given day, I might be talking to people about rebuilding Paychex's tax software for like the next 15 years, or how a certain strategy of building software can be applied, or whether we're well positioned to talk to a certain vendor, which is a conversation I had today. Like if that vendor was to come to talk to us, would we be in a position to give them information so that we could have a mutually beneficial conversation? Like that's a crazy conversation, right? And that's for a company that's a Fortune 1000 company that's trying to like grow and thrive in a very difficult time. And that's not really even a conversation about technology, right? That's like a conversation about people or ideas. It's something in that space. It's like, are our ideas ready for your ideas? Or are they aligned with them? Or are they a little bit different? And like, that's like preparing ideas for like coming into contact with each other is a really hard thing. And it's a big part of, I'm actually launching a company right now. I don't know if I mentioned that in the blurb, and I hope that's okay to plug myself, but I'm actually launching a company that's like what it does is take ideas as best as possible, helps you to kind of categorize, or categorize is the wrong word, like refine the edges away. That same rough edge that I was talking about before, doing that with an idea, the same way that you would with a job or with a person, right? Or a conversation, finding that rough edge and just gradually refining it repeatedly. And you don't expect it to be something that happens overnight, right? But one of the things that you can do is look for help to help you refine those edges. And there's a huge amount of technology tools that will let you look for help to refine edges, right? Like you can just think back on human history and say, like, how often have we decided to refine an edge, right? That's one of our first things that we did, I think, right? So like if we look back and just said, what did humans learn how to do before anything else? I think we might have learned to refine an edge, right? It's probably like that and fire. And I think that that's something that's like an ultra powerful concept. And if you can do those two things together, if you can light a fire and start refining an edge, I think you're cooking. Like that's, your ideas are moving, they're moving faster because your edges are getting more aligned with what you want, and they're on fire. And like, if you think about someone shooting like a fiery arrow off into the distance, the things that you might need a bow too. I don't know how you get the bow. I haven't figured out that part of the analogy yet, but you might need a fire, a sharp edge, and something to launch those, right? So like start building out that toolkit, figure out maybe your family is your bow, right? Maybe your family is what lets you launch those things off into the future. Maybe it's something else. Maybe you meet a cool person in school and they're like, well, hey, I kind of want to launch this thing, right? I don't know, whatever it is. You need a launch point, but you also need, I think, an edge. And if you want to do something that's like highly impactful, you want to light stuff on fire. And those are the two tools for success. I think that's always been the two tools for success. And I think we've kind of lost some of those things. And I tried to instill those every day where I could. And I can't claim that I was always successful, but myself. But that's kind of how I've seen it in that space. I don't know if that answered any of your questions. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. That was great. Thank you. So yeah, we'll open up to any questions. Like I said, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. I guess you did a pretty good job explaining yourself.
I don't know about that. I think maybe I said too much, and everyone's just.
No, I think it was great. Well, if there's no questions, I just want to thank you again for taking the time. We really appreciate it. You know, I came into this myself not knowing a whole lot about what an engineer architect does at all. So it was nice for me on that end. And I'm sure it was very much appreciated by our students and by all our attendees. So again, thank you on behalf of the McQuaid community. And you know, we look forward to hopefully having you be able to come in and speak once we're back in the school.
Yeah. I don't know what the future is going to look like on that front, but I would love to, you know, come back. I think it would be very enjoyable. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the stream now, guys. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, Casey. Do you mind if I actually try and ask one question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is this going to be shareable? Like, I think I asked you that before.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I've actually been recording, so I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna put it up on a news site.